So the next thing I'm going to show you is just how to mattress stitch your squares together. So what mattress stitch does is, what you do is you take your needle and you work from the right side of the square and you go down into a stitch and then up with your needle. So I'm just going to do it in the middle of the square so you can see a little bit more clearly what I'm doing. So you'll go through the center of a stitch. So where the V's of a stocking stitch are there, or of a knit stitch, you go into the center with your wool needle, which has got a blunt end, because if you don't have a blunt end you will split these the wool and spoil your stitches. So try to find a needle with a blunt end. It's easier then to go down the center of the stitch and then up through the next stitch. So can you see my needle has gone under the bar of the stitch, and then if you pull it through, that's what it will look like. But with mattress stitches, when you then cross over and do the same thing on the opposite square, when you pull through, it pulls the squares together and you don't see the stitching. And you'll see that because I'm using this mustard yarn. You wouldn't use mustard to necessarily join all of the squares. What you would probably want to do is choose the lighter colour. So if you've got a multicoloured square and a flat square in one colour, choose the lightest yarn to sew the seam, and then you might have a mustard square here, or red, or whatever colours you are using. You could just choose which colour to use. I'd probably, if it was red, I might go with the grey. Just make a call and go with it, and if it doesn't look great or you can see the stitching, you can always take it out. But hopefully with mattress stitch you shouldn't see the stitching, so I'm just going to show you how it works. So you put your squares together, and what I tend to do is I tend to find the halfway point of my squares. So just roughly fold in half and pop a pin in each square at the halfway point, and then you know that when you get to that point those two pins should be lined up, and if they're not, if one's a bit up and one's a bit down, then I would unpick it so that you know that your squares are going to end at the same point, otherwise they might go a bit skew-whiffed. So I've got my squares and I've got them with the right side uppermost, and I'm going to put the yarn onto my wool needle and I'm going to bring it from the bottom up through the very first corner stitch, and then just pull the yarn through. Leave enough tail end so that you can weave that into your work later. And then I'm going to choose a straight line of knitting. So you need to always work along a straight line. So don't go through, say, this stitch and then on the next one you go through that stitch. You've got to keep your straight line all the way along for a nice neat finish. So I'm just going to go one stitch in. So I'm not going at the very end. I'm going the next stitch in, and I'm going to start, poke my needle from the top into the stitch and up through the next stitch, and then I'm going to pull through. You don't have to pull it really tight at the moment, we can just leave it loose, and then we cross over to the first square and we go down and up through the next stitch and pull the yarn through, and that's it. It's as simple as that. You just keep going to the opposite square, go back into the stitch that you were before, and then up through the next stitch. Now you can miss a stitch and go through two stitches if you want to. You don't have to do every single stitch, but whatever you choose to do it on both squares so that you stay at the same point up for each stitch. So I'm just going to do it with one stitch, just so that my stitches are quite small, and the smaller your stitches, the more invisible they'll become. So down and up, and that's it all the way along. And can you see I'm not pulling it too tightly at the moment, just so that you can see where I'm up to. And then every so often with mattress stitch, if you just pull the yarn, look, it closes up, and look how neat that is. You can't even see that I'm using mustard yarn, which is the beauty of mattress stitch. You can see instantly if you've gone wrong, and you can just pull your wool out of the needle and unpick it. So we're going to go down and up and pick a nice straight line, and honestly it's just quite magical really, because it's so neat. And then you just keep going. It's a bit like a zigzag, like I think sometimes people call it a zipper join. I think I've read it somewhere, but it is like a zip because you're going back and two. And it's just a really neat way to join your squares. Okay, so that's one method. Like I say, the other method, if I just bring my needle through to the back, is the back stitch. So just pretend that we've been using back stitch. I'll just bring that through. So again, you need to make sure that you are just going under those end stitches, but it is harder to get small stitches, I think, with a back stitch, but you know, you can do it that way if you prefer. You can make sure that you're just working in a nice straight line in the same way. Again, if you feel that you've gone wrong, it is quite easy to undo. It's perhaps a bit more time consuming to undo than mattress stitch. If you keep to the very ends, then you know it doesn't look a huge amount different really from the front. So either of those methods can be used. How to do that? So the pattern is to knit the first 2 stitches, and this is row 1 of the border. So you knit the first 2 stitches just like regular knitting. Then to make the twisted stitches, you're going to insert the right needle into the second stitch on the left needle, and we're going to knit that stitch, but we don't take it off the needle. We leave it on, and then we knit the top stitch. And then when we've knitted the top stitch, we can pull them both off. So it's just like knitting a 1x1 cable. You've twisted the stitches, but you haven't had to use a cable needle. So I'll just do that one more time. We're going to knit 2, and then we twist 2. So we knit the second stitch, and then we knit the top stitch, and then we take them both off, and then we knit 2, and then we do that one more time into the second stitch, knit it and don't take it off, and then into the top stitch and knit that, and then take them both off, and then we knit 2. And then the second row is simply knit 2, purl 2 all the way to the end. So it's really easy to remember, and you know, you can just sit and knit this. It would be really enjoyable and creates a really nice stitch pattern. So this is just knit 2 and purl 2 all the way to the end. Now, when you have knitted enough length to go along one side of your blanket, you'll see that there is something special that you need to do to get this piece of knitting to bend around the corner, because if you just kept knitting straight and tried to sew it on and bend it around the corner, it just wouldn't work. So you have to do what's called short row knitting. And that's where you knit part way along the row and you wrap a stitch, and then you turn and you knit back along, and the pattern tells you how many stitches that you knit on each row before you wrap the stitch, turn, and then work back in the pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to do those corner stitches well, how to do a wrap and turn so that you can bend your knitting and get it to go around the corner. Now when you start your corner, you will need to have the wrong side of your work facing. So if you look at the pattern, it says that the short rows are put together in 2 rows. So it says next 2 rows, because what you do is you turn and then you work back the opposite way. So in effect, even though you haven't worked 2 full rows, you have worked on the wrong side and then on the right side. I'll show you what I mean here. So the first row is knit 1, and then it says wrap the stitch. So we're going to wrap the next stitch on the left needle, so we're going to slide it purlwise from the left to the right needle. We're going to bring our yarn between the needles to the front, slide the stitch back again, we're going to turn our work, and then the next row is to knit 1. So that's the first 2 rows complete, and we've wrapped a little bit of yarn around that stitch. And what that does is it stops you from getting holes in your knitting. If you didn't wrap the stitch and you just turned and worked back the other way, the likelihood is you'd get a visible hole in your knitting. And so the next row says to knit 2, and then to purl 2. And then to wrap the next stitch. So we're going to take the yarn to the back now, so we want the yarn to be at the back. We slip the stitch from the left to the right needle, bring the yarn to the front again, slip that stitch back to the left needle without knitting it, and then we turn our work, and then the next of those 2 rows is to pattern to the end. Now we can see here that these next 2 stitches are the twist stitches, so we twist those 2 stitches so that we're maintaining the pattern, and then we knit the next 2 stitches. And what you can see that we're doing here is we're knitting one portion of this strip more times than the end piece, or than the end stitches. So can you see the length on this side of my knitting is a lot longer than the length on this side? And that's because we keep starting from this end and we knit part way along, and then we knit back, and then each time we're knitting more and more stitches. So this is going to be longer and longer, and then what that will do is it will bend around the corner. So this longer edge is going to be the outside edge of your blanket. So when you start sewing the blanket edge onto the squares, you just need to make sure that you sew this end so that the right side, the right hand side of your strip, when the right side of the strip is facing you, is going to be sewn onto the right side of your blanket. I hope that makes sense. Sorry. So can you see where this longer bit is? It's going to be able to bend around that corner as you sew it, and that's how it works. So I hope that helps with the wrap and turn and with the completion of your blanket.